He had 60 seconds to make a decision that would define his entire legacy. Not on the battlefield. Not under enemy fire. In a courtroom. Face to face with a Nazi officer who had ordered the execution of American prisoners of war. And what General George S. Patton did next, most history books refuse to talk about. It was the spring of 1945. The war in Europe was almost over. Germany was collapsing. Cities were falling. Hitler was days away from putting a gun to his own head in a bunker beneath Berlin. But in the final, desperate chaos of those last weeks, something happened that the world would not fully understand for decades. A German SS officer, a man with American blood on his hands, was captured, put on trial, and brought before the most feared, most celebrated, and most controversial general the United States Army had ever produced. What happened in that room? That's what we're going to uncover today. And I promise you, the ending of this story is not what you expect. Let's go back, way back. Because to understand what happened between Patton and this Nazi officer, you first have to understand the kind of war these men were fighting. By late 1944, the Western Front had become a meat grinder. The Allied push through France had stalled. Supply lines were stretched thin. American troops were exhausted, cold, and running dangerously low on ammunition. And Hitler knew it. In December 1944, he launched the most audacious counteroffensive of the entire war. Hundreds of thousands of German troops surged through the dense forests of the Ardennes in Belgium and Luxembourg. History would call it the Battle of the Bulge. But what most people don't know is that this offensive wasn't just a military operation. It was accompanied by something far more sinister. Hidden within the German assault was a special unit. A task force built for one purpose: chaos, confusion, and killing. It was called Kampfgruppe Peiper. And its commander was a man named Joachim Peiper. Remember that name. Joachim Peiper was 30 years old. Blonde, blue-eyed, and by almost every account, terrifyingly calm under pressure. He had served as Heinrich Himmler's personal adjutant. He had fought on the Eastern Front, where he earned a reputation so brutal that his own unit had been nicknamed the Blowtorch Battalion, because of what they left behind when they moved through Soviet villages. Peiper was not just a soldier. He was a true believer. A committed, fanatical member of the Waffen-SS. And in December 1944, Hitler personally entrusted him with one of the most critical missions of the Battle of the Bulge. Peiper's job was to drive a column of tanks deep into Allied territory, cut supply lines, sow terror, and move so fast that the Americans wouldn't be able to respond. For the first 48 hours it worked. But then came a moment that would haunt Peiper for the rest of his life. December 17, 1944. A crossroads near the Belgian town of Malmedy. A convoy of American soldiers, Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, took a wrong turn directly into the path of Peiper's advancing column. They were artillerymen, not frontline infantry. Most of them had never expected to be anywhere near a German armored column. They were captured almost immediately. Approximately 84 American prisoners of war were disarmed and marched into a snowy field near a cafe called the Bognes Crossroads. And then the shooting started. To this day, historians debate the exact sequence of events. But the outcome was not in dispute. When it was over, more than 80 American soldiers lay dead in the snow, shot at close range. Some while raising their hands. Some while running. Some were found with gunshot wounds to the back of the head. The Malmedy Massacre. One of the most notorious war crimes committed against American soldiers on the Western Front. And Joachim Peiper's column had done it. If you're enjoying this story, make sure you subscribe right now, because the ending reveals something most history books barely mention about what really happened after the war, and why this case became one of the most controversial legal battles in American military history. The news of Malmedy spread through Allied lines like wildfire. American soldiers were furious. Officers were furious. And one man, more than almost any other, was absolutely incandescent with rage. General George S. Patton. Now, Patton is a figure most people think they know. The ivory-handled pistols. The pearl-white helmet. The slapping incident. The speeches. The ego. But there was another side to Patton that rarely gets discussed. He genuinely loved his men. Not in a sentimental, soft way, but in the way a warrior loves warriors. He wanted them tough, he wanted them disciplined, but he also wanted them alive. And when the enemy crossed a line, when they violated the laws of war, something in Patton shifted. It became personal. So when Peiper was finally captured at the end of the war, Patton was watching. And the question everyone was asking was, what would happen next? Here's where the story gets complicated. Because this is where history begins to break into pieces that don't quite fit together the way you'd expect. The war ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered. And almost immediately, Allied forces began the enormous, chaotic task of rounding up war criminals. Peiper was captured in May 1945 and handed over to American military authorities. Along with dozens of other SS officers involved in the Malmedy Massacre, he was brought before a military tribunal at the former Dachau concentration camp, a location chosen deliberately. Symbolic. You want to put SS officers on trial? Do it in the shadow of the worst things the SS ever built. The Malmedy Massacre trial began in May 1946. 73 German soldiers stood accused. What happened next shocked everyone. The prosecution presented testimony from survivors, from Belgian civilians who had witnessed the shootings, from forensic experts who had examined the bodies. The evidence was, on its surface, overwhelming, and the verdicts reflected that. 43 men were sentenced to death by hanging. 22 were sentenced to life in prison. 8 received sentences between 10 and 20 years. Joachim Peiper himself was sentenced to death. It should have been over. But it wasn't. Not even close. Because within months of the verdicts being announced, something extraordinary began to happen. The defense lawyers started making noise. Loud noise. They alleged that the confessions used in the trial had been obtained through torture, through physical beatings, through mock executions where German soldiers were blindfolded, led to a wall and told they were about to be shot, only to have blanks fired, over and over again, until they signed whatever document was placed in front of them. They alleged that the American investigators had used burning matches against prisoners' fingernails, had kicked them, punched them, denied them sleep. And here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody saw coming. Some of these allegations turned out to be true. A Senate subcommittee was convened, headed by Senator Raymond Baldwin of Connecticut. They investigated for months, and what they found was deeply uncomfortable. Some of the interrogation methods used on the Malmedy defendants had been improper. Some confessions had been coerced. The legal process, conducted in the chaos of the immediate post-war period, had been rushed and flawed. This did not mean the men were innocent. The massacre happened. The bodies were real. The survivors were real. But it meant the convictions were tainted. And now the entire outcome of the trial was thrown into question. The death sentences were stayed, then commuted, then reduced. One by one, the men convicted of the Malmedy Massacre began to walk free. And Peiper, the man who had commanded the column, his death sentence was first commuted to life in prison, and then, piece by piece, reduced further. But here's the question nobody was asking loudly enough. Where was Patton in all of this? This is where we have to slow down. Because there's a myth that has circulated for decades, and it needs to be confronted directly. Some accounts suggest that Patton, enraged by the massacre and by the thought of these men walking free, made statements, privately, bluntly, characteristically Patton-esque statements, expressing contempt for the entire proceedings. That part is plausible. Sounds like Patton. But here is the truth that most people don't know. Patton never directly confronted Peiper. There was no famous face-to-face encounter. No courtroom showdown. No recorded moment where the general stared down the SS colonel across a table. What there was something more complex, more troubling, and, in many ways, more revealing about the contradictions of post-war justice. Because Patton's relationship to Nazi Germany was not as simple as the war movies suggest. In the summer of 1945, while still serving as military governor of Bavaria, Patton made a series of statements that horrified his superiors and triggered a political firestorm. He was reluctant to aggressively denazify German society. He questioned whether the process was being done fairly. He made a comment, widely reported, in which he compared the difference between Nazis and non-Nazis to the difference between Republicans and Democrats, as if it were merely a political affiliation. Patton did not like the Nazis. Let's be clear about that. He had wept when he toured a concentration camp. He had been physically sickened by what he saw. But Patton was also deeply, instinctively anti-communist. And by the summer of 1945, he was already mentally preparing for what he saw as the next war, against the Soviet Union. In his mind, the Germans, even many former Nazis, were potential allies against Stalin. This was not a popular view. This was not even a defensible view, given what the world had just witnessed. But it was Patton's view, and it got him removed from command. In October 1945, Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army. He was given a meaningless administrative role. The most successful combat general in American history was, in effect, put out to pasture. And then, in December 1945, he was involved in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He was paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later he was dead. He never saw the Malmedy trial. He never saw the verdicts. He never saw the men walk free. And he never faced Peiper directly. So what actually happened to Joachim Peiper? Because this is where the story doesn't end. Not even close. Peiper was released from Landsberg prison in December 1956. After 11 years behind bars. He attempted to rebuild his life in Germany. But his name followed him everywhere. He was recognized wherever he went. Former comrades sought him out. Journalists wrote about him. Veterans groups demanded his rearrest. He eventually settled in France, in the small village of Treves in the Haute-Saône region. He translated books under a pen name. He corresponded with old SS veterans. He lived quietly, away from the attention he couldn't fully escape. And then, in the summer of 1976, local French resistance veterans discovered that a former SS officer, the man responsible for Malmedy, was living in their village. The truth was even stranger than anyone had imagined. Leaflets appeared in the village. Then articles in French newspapers. Then letters. The letters threatened his life. Peiper received warnings. Friends urged him to leave. He refused. On the night of July 13, 1976, the eve of Bastille Day, Peiper's house in Treves was attacked. It was set on fire. When the flames were finally put out, investigators found a body inside. Burned beyond recognition, but later identified by dental records. Joachim Peiper was dead. He was 61 years old. No one was ever charged with his killing. No one was ever arrested. The case was investigated and then effectively closed. To this day it remains officially unsolved. Now step back for a moment. Because this entire story, from the snowy crossroads at Malmedy to the burning house in Treves, raises a question that has no easy answer. What does justice look like after something like this? The men who pulled the triggers at Malmedy, most of them served less than 12 years in prison. Some served far less. The survivors of the massacre lived the rest of their lives with those images. Some never spoke about it. Some couldn't. The Belgian families who lived near that crossroads, who heard the shots, who hid their children, who eventually emerged to find dozens of American boys frozen in the snow, they remembered it for the rest of their lives too. And Patton, the man who raged against the injustice, who wanted these men punished, who represented something simultaneously heroic and deeply flawed about the American military, he died before any of it was resolved. But here's the thing that history keeps forcing us to confront. The Malmedy trial, for all its flaws, for all the procedural failures and the coerced confessions, it was one of the first serious attempts by any military power to hold